Chapter 1. Prepare yourself for the Warning Woods 2024 Halloween special, The House Across the Water. I see a house across the lake, so evil, dark, and lonesome. It steals the beauty of this place, so wonderful and wholesome. Why does that house seem so alive? Its shadows fall my way, shifting closer over time, creeping towards me on the waves. This is the first stanza of a poem I wrote in 5th grade. I'm no Robert Frost, but I was 10, so cut me some slack. Ms. Geralt assigned us to write a poem about our summer vacation by the end of the first week of school. I chose to write about my family's trip to Lorna Shallows, where we rented a lake house for 5 days. Lorna Shallows is a largely private area. Only a few houses on the water are rentals. The majority are occupied by their wealthy owners during the summer and either sit empty or house relatives and friends during the rest of the year. Rental or not, every house near the shore looks stunning. That is to say, all but one. The house I wrote about in my poem. That house loomed across the inlet behind ours. My bedroom window looked out at it. It seemed, although desolate and empty, like a husk for some sinister vitality. A mockery of life, perhaps. I imagined it sending long tendrils or roots out through the water toward our little dock. I received this image like a radio signal, and it stuck with me. Recently, while going through boxes of old things in my parents' attic, I found my poem in a binder simply labeled Tyson, 5th grade. Reading it brought everything that happened in Lorna Shallows back so vividly, I'm forcing myself to sit and write it all down. I'm still not really sure what good it will do, but I have an urge to get it all out regardless. If you are someone about to take in my story, no, I do not expect you to believe it. What happened to me and my family at Lorna Shallows is unbelievable by most people's standards. It involves things I, even at 10 years old, believed to be fiction. These days, I am far less skeptical. My parents learned about Lorna Shallows while searching for a vacation destination far from noisy tourists, long lines, and heavy traffic. It's on the far north side of Lake Lorna, between two sets of hills. We drove through the wooded hills to the east to get there, and could see the rocky western hills across the water when we arrived. Somewhere in those rocky hills hid the Lorna Caverns, the area's only attraction. Some of the bigger caverns and chambers were open to the public, while some of the more complex routes could only be accessed with a licensed guide. Others were available only to spelunkers with the utmost experience and were willing to sign waivers forfeiting rescue should they become trapped. Our house was the only rental on the street. Dad said that was a good thing because the rest of the houses would probably be empty or inhabited by respectful guests. I bet they'll keep to themselves if they're around at all, he said. People who can afford to own properties like this might be the same species as us, but they're different breeds. Mom rolled her eyes, sure she had a week of listening to fun quips like that ahead. I didn't really know what he meant until later. But by then, I would have to disagree. The friend I made out there, who you will meet later, was definitely the same breed as me. Our rental house backed right up to the water. You could practically step onto our dock from the sliding door in the dining room. The first floor was mostly open besides a half wall separating the kitchen/dining area from a windowless den. I assume the lack of windows was intentional, as the den doubled as a miniature movie theater and arcade. A giant projector screen dominated the far wall, and in the back corner stood an emulator with every classic Nintendo, Sega, and PlayStation game. All the bedrooms were on the second floor, as well as a half bathroom. There was a full bathroom off of the master bedroom with heated floors, a jacuzzi, a huge mirror, and, the subject of many of Dad's jokes that week, a bidet. My room was far less exciting, but I still liked it. The walls, floor, and ceiling were all made of wood, and it smelled like a men's formal wear store. My favorite thing might have been the loft bed. Something about sleeping up high felt exciting to me. Possibly the most striking part of my room, though, was the window that, if I stood on the built-in bench in front of it, still stood a foot taller than me. The ceiling slanted, cutting a wedge in the window. The whimsical shape it created made me feel like a character in a storybook. The window had an aura of magic. That is, until I looked through it. Until I saw the house across the water. But now I'm getting ahead of myself. I should take a moment to fully introduce my big sister, Claire. She had just turned 14 that summer, but didn't look that much older than me. Sometimes people asked if we were twins. She tended to stay indoors and read or play video games. I, in contrast, was an active kid who could not stand being stuck inside. Claire and I got along, but due to our differences, we were not especially close. We simply didn't have much in common. Claire took the room down the hall from mine. It also had a big window, but hers faced the trees between our property and the next one. She had a cheery view of birds and squirrels, whereas my view contained no cheer at all. Not with that house in the middle of it. I could not help but stare at that house whenever I found myself near the window. Its roof came to a peak in the middle. Like ours, it backed up to the water and had an empty dock behind it with a small motorboat parked beside it, covered by a brown tarp. A second-story deck on wobbly stilts leaned against the back wall. This wall was cut in half by 8 glass panels, forming a giant window. Many of the panes were cracked, and all looked dusty, even at a distance. I think the house had once been painted white or perhaps baby blue, but the paint had mostly been stripped by the wind, leaving the siding a patchy brown color. Forest green moss clung to the exposed siding, colonizing each crack and crevice. It did appear to be one of the older houses near the water, but its state had more to do with neglect than age. I think the most unnerving aspect of the old house might have been how empty and lonely it felt to me. My first sight of the battered eyesore convinced me it was abandoned. I could not imagine anyone living in such a desolate place. Far back behind this deserted home, the West Hills loomed, and somewhere within them, the Lorna Caverns dug deep into the earth. Everything across the water, to me, felt as shadowy and cold as those ancient caves. Mom and Dad wanted to go for a walk to the marina after dinner. There was a little row of shops down there, some open during the off-season, others not. I complained about being tired and told them I didn't want to go. It seemed like they were going to force me to join until Claire also said she felt like staying back. Claire had made Mom and Dad promise not to force her into any of the activities they did that week because, as she put it, she needed a vacation too. Unwilling to leave her alone so soon after arriving in the unfamiliar area, our parents told me I could stay back after all, as long as I stayed with Claire. I agreed, knowing what would happen as soon as Mom and Dad closed the door. I had made this hollow promise dozens of times before. Claire didn't want my company any more than I wanted to be stuck with her. I left Claire inside and walked down to our dock for the first time. The inlet lapped toward me lazily. The little wave tops looked especially black against the pink reflection of the sunset, which painted the rest of the water. The dock wobbled beneath my bare feet, making me dance against my will. I sat at the end with my legs dangling. Only my toes could reach the water. It felt delightfully cold. I tried to focus on the beautiful lake expanding from the inlet, the lush trees surrounding it, the vibrant sky above. But the ominous house across the water continually pawed at my attention. I finally succumbed to the impulse to study it again. New details I observed in the fading light included shingles hanging from the edge of the roof, a prominent crack in the chimney, and thick cobwebs woven beneath the sagging back deck. Further evidence, in my mind, of abandonment. Lost in observation, I was startled by something brushing against my wet toes. It felt slick and warm in the brief moment it touched me. I pulled my legs up to safety before gripping the dock and peering down into the water. A buoy of pale skin bobbed in the rippling waves. I could make out the bony lumps of a spine and ribs about the same size as mine. The short brown hair floating in front of the torso, hiding the face, told me the body probably belonged to a boy. His limbs drifted below him, listlessly. The body bumped into the dock. I felt its gentle impact. Bubbles erupted from the boy's downturned mouth, and his body slowly sank below the surface. I watched intently, wanting to scream but unable to find my voice. Besides, there was no one within earshot besides maybe Claire, who most likely had headphones on anyway. A sudden, enormous splash forced a scream out of me, though. The boy burst upward, arms stretched toward me, wanting to drag me in like Jason at the end of Friday the 13th, a movie which I would see a few years later. I fell back on my elbows. The dripping, pale boy caught the edge of the dock and pulled himself halfway up, but then gave up. From laughing too hard. "You should see your face right now," the healthy living boy laughed. "Who are you?" I asked angrily, still coming down from the shock he gave me. "I'm Brett," he said. He dragged his legs up and spun around to sit in front of me. "I live in the house next door. I came out here to swim and saw you spacing out." "I wasn't spacing out," I lied. "Well, you didn't notice me swim all the way over here from our dock," said Brett. "That's why I decided to scare you." I looked down the bank and saw Brett's dock jutting out through cattails. I couldn't understand how I had missed him. Or wait. Yes, I could. The house. That should give you an idea of its power to captivate me. "I thought you were a real dead body," I said. He laughed again and howled, "I know." Before I realized it, I was laughing too. He had executed the prank with finesse. He got me good, and I knew I could either be sore about it or join in the fun. "I'm Tyson, but everyone calls me Ty," I said. "My family doesn't live here. We're just renting this house for a few days." Brett said, "Yeah, that's what most people do. A lot of boring people with no kids rent this house, so I'm glad you're here this time. Got any siblings?" "Just a sister, Claire, but she's..." I struggled with what to say for a second. "She doesn't go outside much." "Is she hot?" Brett asked. Had I known him longer than 2 minutes, I would have shoved him off the dock. He flinched away like he expected me to do just that, and we both laughed again. Brett and I talked for a while. I learned that his family spent most of the year in Lincoln, Nebraska, where his dad ran some big agricultural equipment company. I wish I could remember the name of it. You know how it is as kids. You don't pay much attention to what grown-ups do unless it directly affects you. Brett's mom worked part-time for some real estate agent in the Lincoln area and volunteered with the rest of her time. He went to a private school in Nebraska, but the teachers let him complete part of the year remotely. Apparently, many of the students in his class spent time at second homes. He said his family didn't usually stay in Lorna Shallows for long during the off-season, so it was lucky he was still there when I showed up. For my part, I told Brett basically everything I've told you about my family so far. My parents returned from their walk sooner than I'd expected, or maybe I just lost track of time. After Brett swam home, Mom scolded Claire for letting me go out and meet strangers alone, and me for not obeying her orders to stay with Claire. I brushed it off easily enough. Having made a friend for the week, I found myself in high spirits with nothing but excitement for the days ahead. It wasn't until I went up to bed that night that I was reminded of the desolate house across the inlet. The sky looked beautiful that night. I could see millions of stars and the half moon high in the peak of the window from my bed. I would have loved to lay there staring at them as I fell asleep, but I had to get up and close the curtain. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I felt that decrepit house across the inlet staring back at me, as if the 8 panes of its giant rear window were the eyes of a crouched spider waiting for a chance to strike. Chapter 2. I visited the evil house one morning with my friend. We thought it was abandoned, but a man was there instead. He showed me every room inside. He opened every door. But his friendliness was a disguise. His smile was a lure. I woke before my family the next morning and went out on the dock to watch the sunrise with a dry bowl of Fruit Loops. Sunlight bounced off of the water, forcing me to squint, but the rest of my senses saw for me. My skin absorbed the growing warmth of the sun, balanced pleasantly by a cool breeze coming off of the water. My nose detected the soil-rich scent of the shore, tinged with a sour green smell from the algae under the dock. Behind this scent wafted the lingering smell of pine. I tasted an invigorating freshness on the morning breeze, which, in part, shifted my general attitude toward the house across the lake. In those quiet, early hours, the memory of my anxiety seemed silly and childish. With nothing better to do, I decided I might go check the place out. From a distance, of course. I wondered if maybe the front of the house looked more welcoming. Maybe a closer examination would allow me to see the house from more than one new perspective. I followed our long driveway to the winding road that followed the curve of the inlet, which I figured would eventually lead me by the abandoned house. Not too far along, something struck the back of my head. I ducked and spun on my heels, almost collapsing on the gravel. A miniature pine cone rested near my feet. I assumed it fell from one of the overhanging trees and hit my unlucky head. But after a few steps, I was struck again. This time the projectile, another small pine cone, rolled to a stop in front of my feet. I spun around. The confused look on my face, very stupid, I'm sure, made my assailant laugh. Brett, the boy I met on the dock the previous day, stepped out from behind one of the thick trees in his front yard. He asked, "Where are you walking to?" I shook my head at him, then shrugged. I didn't want to tell him my intended destination at first, but then decided a companion might be nice. Brett seemed like the sort of high-spirited kid that would be good to have around if things got spooky. "I'm walking up to that abandoned house across the water," I admitted. "The one straight across from our house. I bet you can see it from your house, too." "Oh yeah, I can see it," Brett confirmed. "Dad complains about it all the time. Says he wishes they would just tear it down already." "Who should tear it down?" I asked. "Not sure. The neighborhood people, I guess." "So it is abandoned?" I asked. Brett shook his head. He picked up a long stick and prodded the gravel with it as he walked and talked. "There's this guy. I can't remember his name, but everybody calls that place the Craw House, so maybe that's his last name. It's kind of famous because the rest of the guy's family all died in there like 10 years ago." "Seriously?" I asked. Yeah, my parents always try to hide stuff like that from me, but I always find out. I think his sister freaked out and killed her parents, then she killed herself or something like that. Anyway, still want to check it out? I don't know. Will the guy get mad if he sees us? I asked. So what if he does? Brett replied. I've never even seen him. He's always got all the curtains shut. I bet he won't even notice a couple kids like us. I said, okay, just a quick look. Brett said, cool, but we don't have to walk. I've got a few bikes you can pick one from. Brett led me around his house to a little overhang under which 6 bicycles rested against each other. He explained that people often left bikes behind at the rentals, and the management companies would just put them on the curb with the trash. Brett liked to fix them up and either keep them or sell them to a guy named Harry who ran a convenience store and owned a bike rental service. A red Huffy fit me perfectly. The front shocks had rusted stiff, but it would do fine for our short ride around the inlet. We pedaled up the road. Brett led me directly to the apparently infamous Craw house. Contrary to my earlier hopes, the face looked no better than the rear. Up close, the whole building appeared to lean back toward the water. The high peak of its triangular roof loomed above us as we stood in its shadow. A circular window near the top stared down at us like the eye of a giant cyclops. Perhaps I would have seen it as less threatening if Brett had not so casually mentioned the murders a few minutes before. My feelings from the previous night started pushing out the more positive ones I'd found that morning. I dare you to sneak inside, Brett teased. I looked at him like he was crazy, and he laughed. He said, just imagine somewhere behind that door, a whole family died, one after the other. And now this place is just sitting here, exactly like it was that night, getting older and older, and rotting, and... I noticed 2 fingers and 2 eyes peeking out from behind a curtain on the ground floor. Brett, I whispered. He stopped looking at the house to look at me, just as the eyes and fingers disappeared. What? Brett asked. Still whispering, I said, let's get out of here. Somebody saw us. He struggled to turn his bike around. It kept trying to roll down the shoulder into the Crawl's unkempt front yard. The front door latch clicked. I jumped onto my bike, ready to pedal away, and the chain popped right off of the gears. My pedals rotated freely. My leg dropped and I lost my balance, falling away from the bike as it crashed to the ground. Brett finally managed to turn his bike around, but stopped when he saw my predicament. You all right? A man's voice called from the house. My head heavy with dread, I looked up. A man with messy black hair and a baggy white t-shirt stood in the doorway of the Craw house. His small blue eyes were trained on me. They flicked down to my bike's floppy chain, then back to my face. I felt like a rodent backed into a corner by a feral cat. We're good, Brett answered for me. Yeah, we're good, I echoed. The man stepped out of his house onto the front porch. He said, You sure? Looks like your chain came off. I have some tools. He pointed into the house with his thumb. That's okay, I don't need tools to fix it, Brett said, and I hoped he wasn't lying. The man replied, Well, drag it into my yard at least. I don't want you getting run over. In fact, I'll come stand by you and make sure people see you. He stepped off of the porch. No, really, it's okay, I tried to say, but the man was already walking toward us. I could tell he was abnormally thin beneath his baggy shirt and baggier sweatpants. His face looked like it had deflated around his skull, too. But his eyes looked healthy and sharp, and not one of his hairs had faded to gray. He didn't look older than maybe 35. He smiled at me as he arrived at the edge of his yard and picked up my bike. I insist, he said as he dropped the kickstand and set the bike upright. Then he turned to Brett. "All yours." Brett got to work, leaving me and the man to just stand and watch. Feeling awkward, I asked, so what's your name?" The man leaned away slightly and crossed his arms. He looked down at his feet and, drawing out the words as if second-guessing each letter, he said, "I'm Nico." "Nico Craw?" Brett asked. "Heh." Nico scratched the back of his head, then crossed his arms again. "You guys are so young. Wow, and you still know about that?" "Not much about it, really," I said, covering in case Nico was sensitive about his family's tragedy. "Were you related to the family who got murdered?" asked Brett. So much for sensitivity. Yeah," said Nico. "I'm their son. It was my parents and my sister who, died here." "How's that chain looking?" Brett replied, "It's gonna be easy. I just gotta pull it over this gear and then... Oh, great." His tone dropped on the last word. "What?" I asked. "Oh, one of the teeth is bent. I just need a couple big rocks." I helped him look, but he found both of the rocks he needed himself and started bending the problematic gear tooth back into place. "I like the big windows on the back of your house. I bet it's nice in there," I said, just trying to be friendly as we stood and watched Brett work. "So you must be in that big house across the inlet, huh?" Nico asked rhetorically. "That's a nice one. And yes, my house probably doesn't look like much on the outside. Who am I kidding? It looks terrible. But it's pretty nice inside. Would you like to come take a look while your friend takes care of this?" He sounded unsure whether it was appropriate to invite me, and I'm guessing my face showed how inappropriate I found the suggestion. He unfolded his arms and held his hands up, palms open. "Sorry, I know that's not the sort of thing a stranger should ask a kid. I promise I'm not... Well... It's okay," I said. "Do you have any friends around here? I thought most people left during the off-season." "I stay year-round," Nico replied. "But no, to answer your question, it does get fairly lonely. I like to be here in the fall and winter, though. This is where my family stayed a lot of the time over the holidays and just to get away." Brett grunted and said, "I can't get it." I knelt beside him. "Let me try." Brett stood to let me work. He brushed his hands on his jeans and awkwardly glanced up at Nico, then back down at the bike. Nico laughed to himself. He said, "You're local, aren't you? I think I've seen you riding around." "Yeah, that's me," Brett replied coolly. Nico said, "Man, I can't imagine all the stories you've heard about me and my house, right? What's the best one?" "Honestly, my parents don't talk about it, so mostly I just read a little bit about what happened online." "Well," Nico trailed off, seeming to consider carefully before asking, "Want to hear the real story while you wait? I'd rather you hear it from me than whatever gossip the locals spread around here." I looked up, not believing how casually Nico brought up his own family's murder. I guess Brett had said 10 years or more passed since it happened, but I still couldn't imagine talking about something so heinous the way Nico did, like it was a story about spring break. "Yeah, I guess so," Brett answered. Nico did not wait for a response from me. Nico said, "All right. Well, it happened almost 11 years ago now on Halloween night. You'd have to ask my sister if that was on purpose. It may have been a coincidence, but I'm personally not sure. My sister, Nina, had a serious interest in the occult. You guys know what that means?" We both nodded. "I don't think she was intentionally exploring anything evil, but something evil found her, whether she meant it to or not. That Halloween night, Nina slipped some pills into our parents' wine and knocked them out. Then she tied ropes around their necks and hung them. First Dad, then Mom. From the rear deck. He let this linger a moment. I had managed to straighten the gear tooth already, but said nothing to Brett yet because we were both entranced. I'm glad, that Nina drugged them, Nico continued. I like to think they were still unconscious when it happened. I hope they didn't even realize they were dying until they were gone. Nina, though, I don't know what she was feeling. I can't imagine the mental state of someone who could do that to her own parents. To top it off, she tied a third rope around her own neck and threw herself off after them. Brett noticed I'd fixed the tooth and we swapped places by the bike. Aren't you sad about it? And doesn't it freak you out to live here where something so scary happened? I asked. Yeah. What if what happened to your sister happens to you? Asked Brett. Oh, Nico laughed. No, I don't think that'll happen. The place just feels like any other house now. Not to be weird again, but you two are welcome to come check it out if you want. I can show you, where it all happened. He smiled a fox's smile at us. His eyes glinted blue. I was grateful to hear the pedals of my bike clunk as Brett finished setting the chain. We're good to go, he announced. Oh, come on, just a quick peek inside. Your parents are right across the inlet. They can see the house, Nico insisted. I felt trapped between fear and an ingrained prohibition against rudeness. I'd never been put in such a situation by an adult before. Ty, let's go, Brett urged. I watched Nico's expression darken. He said, So you'll sneak around and spy on my house? You'll listen to me talk about the greatest tragedy of my life like it's some campfire story, and then you're just gonna ride off? I mean, please, we're in broad daylight now. This was only partially true. Do you really think I'd try to hurt you? Ty, dude, let's... Shh. I shushed Brett because I thought I also heard someone call my name in the distance. Tyson? Tyson Worth! Yes, there it was again. It sounded like my mother yelling my name from the dock behind our house. How long had they been awake, wondering where I was? Not even Claire knew where I was going. Sorry, I really have to go, I told Nico. I nodded at Brett, who gave me a look that said, Finally! Nico stammered. Well, hold on. My rear deck is right across from your house, remember? Go out there and tell your mom you're okay. He smiled, that fox's smile. I looked at the sides of his yard, which were completely overgrown, providing no easy path back to the dock. I replied, No thanks, I'm just gonna hurry back. Oh, come on, do you hear how worried she sounds? Just let her know you're all right. What if we just went out on his dock for a second? I quietly asked Brett. He snarled back, Ty, I'm not going anywhere near his house. Let's go. Guys, it's straight through the house. I'll show... Before he finished, tires crunching gravel rushed toward us from around the bend. I recognized my family's car instantly. Dad had the window down. The second he saw me, he slammed on the brakes and leaned out. Tyson, you go straight back home right now, he barked. To Nico, he said, I'm sorry, sir. Were they bothering you? They didn't break something, did they? Not at all, sir, Nico replied, using a smoother voice than before. One of their bike chains fell off. I've been watching over them while they fixed it. Handy boys you've got. Oh, well, thanks for keeping an eye on them. Tyson, if you're not halfway home by the time I get this car turned around, I swear to God. And you, Dad trailed off when he looked at Brett. After a pause, he finished, You should probably get home too. I bet your parents are worried. My back tire spat rocks I pedaled so hard. Brett and I left Nico behind without another word to or from him. I made it halfway home before Dad caught up with us. He honked, prompting us to move to the side of the road. As he passed by, loud rock music blared from his windows. I told Brett I hoped the music would improve his mood. I would need any advantage I could take. I returned my bike to Brett's overhang and told him I would come see if he could hang out the next time I was free. At home, I had some explaining to do. I told my parents my original plan to walk to the house and straight back, but how Brett had attacked me and offered the bike, then how the chain fell off, and Dad interjected. When I found them, some random guy was helping them. See what I mean? Mom blurted. That guy could have been anybody. He could have seen a little boy with a broken bike and thought, boy, this'll be easy. How close she may have gotten to the actual truth made me pause for a second. I briefly considered telling her, then instantly realized giving credence to my parents' concerns could backfire over the coming days. I was with Brett. I wasn't alone, I defended. Dad said, look, the point is that we didn't know where you were. You could have told your sister, or I would have broken his neck if he woke me up to tell me something that stupid, Claire cut in. Dad ignored her. Mom said, all we're saying is let us know where you're going to be so then we can all go have fun and not have to worry, okay? Okay, I conceded. It wasn't too much to ask. We ate breakfast together, big fluffy pancakes my dad made to go with my mom's famous ham and cheese omelets. Despite the fragrant feast, I couldn't help but think of Nico sitting alone in the dark in his house across the water. Our existences seemed so completely opposite. I found myself looking at Claire, wondering if she could ever kill Mom and Dad. If that happened, would I end up like Nico, living alone in a crumbling house and talking to children for company? And, perhaps, trying to lure them in? No, I didn't think so. I hoped not anyway. Something about Nico spooked me, chilled my bones. Picturing his smile caused actual shivers to run down my spine. Something about him seemed almost robotic. He didn't seem stiff in the sense that he was uncomfortable around us, but like he was hurrying. He seemed like an actor rushing each line before he forgot the next. Why had he wanted to get us into his house so badly? I hated to dwell on this question, but I had to. I needed an answer, yet a large part of me hoped I would never get one. Chapter 3. A man named Harry helped me explore the house's past, the horrors and the tragedy that made the evil last. There's something in the attic, and Harry thought he knew. But if the old man was correct, then fiction might be true. By day 3 of our vacation, Mom and Dad were fed up with Claire sitting in her room by herself. To force her out of the house, they assigned us a task. There's a convenience store down by the marina, Mom told us that morning. We need more eggs, probably a couple more bags of chips, and some lunch meat if they have it, tuna if they don't. Why can't Ty just go by himself? He could just take his friend, Claire whined. Dad said, because the two of you need to spend some time together, and you, he pointed at Claire, need to get out and enjoy this place. They bickered more, but Claire won no ground. My parents had made up their minds. It's gonna take forever to walk all the way to the marina, Claire whined. We had barely left the driveway. Maybe we can borrow a couple of Brett's bikes, I offered. Hold on. I ran ahead of Claire to knock on Brett's door. His mom answered. She looked unhappy to see me, and I guessed Brett told her about our brush with Nico Craw the day before. Polite as I could be, I said, "We're going to the store. Can Brett please come?" "Harry's?" Brett's mom interrogated. Maybe? It's down by the marina," I said. Brett's mom called through the house for Brett, then turned back to me and said, "Stay away from that old house from now on, got it? Don't go near it again. And don't you ever let my son go near it either." "Don't worry, I won't," I replied, looking at my shoes. Brett came to the door and his mom left us alone. I asked if he wanted to go to the store with us and if we could use his bikes to get there. He gave me the same one I rode the day before and let Claire pick one out when she finally caught up, and the three of us pedaled away. We soon rode past Nico's house. I tried not to look at it, even when Claire pointed to it and asked if that was where the creep lived. Brett sped ahead, and I scolded Claire for pointing. However, I could not pass by without glancing once to see if Nico was watching us from inside. The windows were too dusty. I could not tell. We made it to the convenience store in good time. It faced the marina from the other side of the road. The roof slanted up in front like I'd seen on diners in old movies. A faded sign above the door read, "Harry's." Inside, 5 or 6 aisles ran from the back of the store to the front counter, so the watchful old clerk could easily keep an eye on suspicious characters like us. Brett helped us gather what we needed, and we met at the front counter. The clerk, a wind-worn man with skin like the cover of a storybook, eyed us all curiously as he slid our items toward the register. "Hi, Harry," said Brett. "Hey, Brett," the old clerk replied. To me, Brett said, "This is Harry. He's the guy I sell bikes to sometimes." "Your parents had enough of you, huh?" Harry asked us. I could tell he meant this question in good fun. The memories of his own youthful days glimmered behind his eyes. "No, well, kind of," I bashfully replied. Harry began calculating our total on a notepad. As we waited, the bell above the door jingled, signaling the entrance of another customer. I, too busy eyeing the shelves of candy below the counter, did not turn to look at whoever came in, until I heard Claire mutter, "Check out this weirdo." Curious, I turned. So did Brett. Somehow, I knew before I saw him who had entered. Now dressed in a black trench coat and slacks and wearing dirty black boots, Nico looked like the villain from a detective novel. He paused at the back of the store and scanned the aisles as if choosing where to start. I ducked to avoid being seen. Just a second, I forgot to grab something," I said. I slipped into an aisle out of Nico's view. Brett followed me. So did Harry's watchful eyes. Claire stayed by the counter, observing us with disdainful curiosity. Nico shopped quickly, soon making his way to the register. Brett and I crouched to remain hidden as he took his place in line behind Claire with an armful of goods. There, he turned his back to the counter and continued to scan the aisles. "Your total is $10.72, Harry informed Claire. "Tyson, you have the money," she sang across the store. I stayed put. Harry turned to Nico and said, "How about I help you real quick, sir? We'll give these kids a moment to sort out their payment." He glanced in Brett and I's direction with the stoic eyes of a guardian. Nico stepped forward and set his goods on the counter. "You find everything okay?" Harry asked. Without meeting his eyes, Nico said, "Oh, yes, thank you." Having set his items down again, he turned back to face the store and, again, scanned. "Are you sure there's nothing else I can help you find?" Harry asked, his voice drenched in suspicion. Nico looked startled at being called out and turned back to the counter. Brett and I, crouched behind a vertical display box of gigantic Slim Jims, watched all of this through a narrow slit in the display. I saw Claire standing uneasily beside Nico and wished I could say something to her. Why hadn't she just followed our lead? Well, because she had not seen Nico's fox-like smile before. She had not looked into his cold blue eyes and felt trapped by them yet. Harry said. $12.53. Cash? Nico opened a floppy leather wallet and slid him a $20 bill. Out of 20? Harry opened the register. He thumbed a few quick bills out of the till, dashed a handful of coins into his palm, and handed the change to Nico. It took Nico a moment to notice because he had already started looking for us again. A moment longer, and he might have detected us, but Harry cleared his throat, and Nico finally noticed the offered change. He shoved the loose cash into his wallet, stuffed that in his pocket, and, almost forgetting his purchases on the counter, left in a huff. Brett and I pivoted into the aisle to stay out of his sight. After the doorbell faded, Harry asked, "Why you boys frightened of Mr. Craw there?" We returned to the counter, where Brett played dumb, but I recognized something trustworthy in Harry's warm, knowing eyes. I said, "We met him yesterday, and he seemed, You went and checked out his house, did you?" asked the knowing clerk, and we nodded. To Brett, he said, "You been around here long enough. Don't you know the stories about that place?" "I only knew people got murdered there before that guy Nico told us the whole story," Brett said. "Ah, but which version did he tell you?" asked Harry. "Hey, Ty, we should probably get going," Claire quietly interjected. "Oh, just hold on a minute," eased Harry. "If your brother, he's your brother, yeah? He should hear both sides of the story before he goes poking around places where he don't belong." "No, that's okay," Claire insisted. "You'll stay away from that house from now on, right, Ty?" "Stop," I said, trying to make myself sound older. "I want to hear it." "It'd be a wise thing to hear," said Harry. "It happened during the fall while most folks was away. Only the Crawls weren't away like most folks. They stayed up here often when others were gone. Must have liked the quiet." "Nico said it happened on Halloween," Brett said. "Did it?" asked Harry. I thought he was asking one of us, but I realized he was checking his own memory. "Well, I can't say I remember it happening that way, but that don't mean it didn't. The particular date isn't that important, though. Doesn't matter when it happened. It'd be no less tragic any day, holiday or none. Anyway, a visiting father took his young son out fishing in the shallows. They were locals from the south end of the lake, came up just for a day. It was a foggy morning from what I heard, and real early. As the sun rose and the fog started to clear, the father realized they'd drifted over by somebody's dock. Turned out to be the Crawl's dock out there." He pointed in the general direction of Nico's house. "So he fires up the motor and goes to put some distance between them and the shore, but he notices 3 people standing and watching him through the fog first. They're standing on the back porch of the Craw house, yeah, or so he thinks. As he looks, he sees they're not moving, except a little rotating back and forth like in a slow dance. He sees their feet aren't quite touching the ground, though. You see what I'm getting at?" Claire nodded affirmatively and placed her hands on my shoulders, pulling me back from the counter. But I stayed, transfixed by the story. So far, I thought, it didn't contradict anything Nico said. It all could have been true. Listening to Harry was like hearing the next chapter in a book we were slowly finding pages to hidden throughout the shallows. "The 3 figures that the fisherman and his poor son, probably no older than any of you, found hanging from the rear deck were Mr. and Mrs. Craw and their 15-year-old daughter, Nina. Desiccated, bone dry like mummies they were. Not all puffy and bloated like a body usually. Well, now I've really gone too far, haven't I?" If my face matched Brett's, I could see why Harry thought he'd crossed a line. But I could also tell the story wasn't over. Harry continued, "That's about the most graphic part, but far from the scariest, my friends. Unfortunately, I think this is the bit you most need to know. You want to hear it?" We all, very hesitantly, nodded. "So Nico, who you've all met now, he's the Craw's eldest, their son. He was 20 years old when his parents and sister were murdered. And I do say they were all murdered, even though the police think the daughter did it all herself. Gone crazy from all that black magic she was into. Nico was supposedly away when his family got strung up from the back deck. He claims to have been at college, but let me tell you." "How old are you?" Harry asked Claire. "I'm 14, she said, caught so off guard she had to think about it. "Okay, so imagine a girl just a little older than yourself and not much bigger either. You tell me, do you think you could drag your daddy through the house and hoist him over the rail of the deck? No? How about your mama? Listen, kids, I served in Vietnam and had to pick up my fair share of bodies. Even somebody who's just knocked out weighs about twice what you'd expect when you try to lift them up. So I just don't think the official story holds up against common sense." "So who do you think did it?" Brett asked. Harry folded his hands together and leaned forward on his elbows. He looked off to the side, then back at us, stopping to meet each of our gazes in turn. He said, "Look, kids, I don't have any more evidence than the police, okay? I never saw the crime scene for myself, nor did any investigating. So take what this old man says with a grain of salt. All I know is no sooner did they cut the police tape off the front porch of that house than did Nico Craw move himself in. He's been living off his parents' money in their house and not having to share a dime with anybody, 'cause now he's the last of their kin. Things worked out pretty well for old Nico, wouldn't you say? He's done nothing but let that house go to rot ever since. I don't know how he gets away with it. No one around here trusts him. No one likes him. Maybe the HOA's afraid to step in. Maybe they're worried they'll end up hanging off of their own porches." "Are you saying that guy who just came in here killed his family and got away with it?" Claire asked. "I'm just voicing my suspicions, honey, and offering up what warning I can," Harry answered. "What you want to believe is totally up to you. Just think about what I've told you before you spend any more time near that house." We said our thanks, gathered our items, and made for the front door. I pressed on the handle, but just as I pushed the door far enough to make the bell ring, Harry groaned, causing us all to turn back to look at him. "There's one more story you should hear," he said. "Another rumor, I suppose." "What is it?" I asked. Claire muttered, "Come on, Ty, let's go already." Harry said, "Some folks suspect they know why Nico Craw stays around here, and if he did kill his family, why he did it. Or rather, who he did it for." He now had all of our attention again. "I don't suppose your parents talk much about the drownings we're plagued with out here? You might have heard, have you, son?" he asked specifically of Brett. "I've heard of visitors drowning, yeah," Brett answered. "Don't they just get drunk and fall off boats and stuff?" "The children?" Harry asked. "Wait, kids drown?" Brett asked back. "All the time," Harry repeated, airily. "That ain't a normal thing, is it? So many drownings in an area with so few people. A lot of folks, they don't think Nico Craw's done killing. No, they say Nico Craw serves something evil. Some say, maybe, it's a vampire." Claire pushed around me to open the door herself and usher us out. As we were forced to leave, Brett and I shouted thanks. Harry watched us go with a stony expression of concern, but also satisfaction, having done his part to share with us the potential danger. "What a crackpot," Claire said as she mounted her bike. Brett said, "Seriously, vampires? Only like babies believe in that stuff." "Yeah," I conceitedly agreed. Harry didn't need to go so far as vampires to scare me. He disturbed me enough with the new portrait of Nico Craw his story had painted in my mind. Like the previous 2 nights, I turned out my lights and stood at my bedroom window, looking out across the water at the Crawl house. Each night it appeared larger, more dominant on the opposite shore. Perhaps the new information I kept gathering each day could be blamed for the illusion. I took out my binoculars and sat on my knees on the windowsill. I focused the lenses, zoomed as far as I could without blurring the image, and searched for hints about Nico's secret life, or, admittedly, any evidence of vampires. I scanned the 8 windows on the back, half expecting to find Nico staring back at me, but he must have been shut up in another part of the house. I shifted my position on the seat to get more comfortable. When I put my eyes back to the binoculars, they were pointed at Nico's dock. I slowly raised them, trying to find the window again. On the way up, I caught sight of something that made me drop the binoculars and cower under the sill. Hanging from Nico's crumbling rear deck were 3 desiccated figures, 2 women and 1 man. Their faces, though I could only glimpse them for a second, were nothing but leather-bound skulls. Their eyes, lips, and noses had either rotted away or been pecked off by birds. Their clothes hung from their shrunken frames in rags, and their bare feet swung just a foot or 2 off the ground. The 2 females' long black hair fluttered and twisted in the breeze as all 3 bodies rotated back and forth. When I composed myself enough to look again, I saw there were no hanging figures twisting in the wind after all. I was relieved to know I had only perceived them in my imagination. I closed the curtain and scampered up to my bed. There, I lay awake for hours, knowing for certain only nightmares awaited me in my sleep. Chapter 4. Store, an evil rumor of the Crawls, the family who had lived before in that house of must and mold. But the truth, it came too late, you see, to save us all from death. By the 4th night of our lakeside spree, my friend would take his final breath. I slept horribly that 3rd night of our trip and woke the 4th day feeling sickly. I had a headache and my legs ached from riding Brett's spare bicycle all over the community. I scorned the idea of getting up to anything too active that day. The dock looked pleasant as I stared out at it while eating breakfast. I figured I would take a page out of Claire's book and do some reading out there. Then, maybe later, if I felt better, I would head over to Brett's to see if he wanted to hang out. I knew I would miss Brett when we left Lorna Shallows. I had friends back home, but none that I got along with quite like him. I tried telling Mom and Dad I was too tired to do anything major that day, but Dad showed me a nasty storm building to our west on the radar. He thought by late that night or early the next day, we might be stuck inside, which meant that morning would be our last chance to check out the Lorna Caves. Despite my poor energy, the prospect of wandering through dark, ancient caves excited me. Claire took more convincing, but eventually she came around to the idea too. Mom and Dad let us wander around the gaping public cavern on our own while they took in views from atop the West Hills. We could already see dark clouds building in the western sky. Claire and I found the entrances to multiple dark tunnels and spent a few minutes staring into each, letting our eyes adjust to the darkness and watching as more rocks and stalagmites slowly appeared to us. Think there's a lot of bats in there? Claire asked. Something in her voice made me suspicious of this question, but I answered anyway. I mean, probably. Think there are any vampire bats? Claire teased. I rolled my eyes. After a few minutes, Mom and Dad rejoined us. Dad chose a tunnel to follow, and we followed him. He led the way with his flashlight, the big one he always kept in the glove box of our car. The cave possessed a certain chill that vented right through my clothes. It felt like a refrigerator in there. An image of raw meat stacked in neat rows on one of the rocky shelves above us, wrapped in brown butcher paper, came to mind. But then, in my mind's eye, the butcher paper transformed into leathery skin clinging to the meat and bones. The neat rows of beef, pork, and chicken transformed into the 3 bodies that had flashed into my imagination the night before, and I banished all thoughts about meat and flesh from my mind. The tunnel took us through a network of slim channels. Mom frequently turned around to ask Claire if I was still behind her. Claire seemed annoyed with me about this, but I didn't know what I could do differently. At an apparent dead end, we turned back. Dad took the lead again, but I fell in behind Mom to absorb her frequent check-ins. As we neared the cave entrance, we heard authoritative voices speaking urgently and squawking radios ahead. They echoed to us, making their words impossible to decipher even though they occasionally seemed to be directed at us. When we emerged, a police officer, one of 2 in the cavern, hurried up to Dad. "Is there a boy with you named Brett?" she asked. My stomach seized. Why were the police looking for Brett? And why in the caves? "No, it's just us," Dad replied. "We were the only ones here when we got here, and we haven't seen anybody else." The officer nodded. "Okay, I'm going to ask you folks to please step outside the cave so we can look around." "Of course," Dad replied. The officer speaking with him turned to the other officer, shook her head subtly, and gestured for him to continue without her. Mom asked, "Is there anything we can do to help?" The officer's gaze lingered on me before she said, "Maybe I could just get your names real quick and a phone number in case we need to contact you." She wrote down our names and the cell number Dad gave her, then Mom walked us outside. 2 other officers pulled into the parking lot down the hill where we'd left our car. They passed us on their way up to the cave. Both of them eyed me, eyes lingering like the first officer's, but they said nothing. Dad?" I tentatively asked. He gave me a slight nod, waiting for the officers to pass before answering. I didn't wait for him. "I think they might be looking for my friend." Now I had Dad's attention. "Is Brett the boy you've been hanging out with?" he asked. I nodded. Without a word, Dad turned me around and ushered me back up the path. The officer who asked us to leave came out looking concerned. "Excuse me, sorry," Dad said. "But did you say you're looking for a Brett? It's maybe not important, but my son's been playing with a kid named Brett all week." I hated how he phrased that. Playing with Brett. If only he knew what we had gotten up to while playing. He might have known how scared I felt for my friend. In the distance, I could see the ominous peak of the Craw house through the trees. It felt like that circle window in the middle was watching me, warning me not to say anything about it. "Brett Jones?" the officer asked me. I stammered, I don't know his last name. If Brett ever mentioned it, I had forgotten. "Well, he's about your age, your height, brown hair, brown eyes. That sounds like him," I said dreadfully. She asked, "When was the last time you saw him?" Yesterday before dinner. I haven't seen him today." "I'm sorry," Dad interrupted. "Did something, is he, missing?" By now, Mom and Claire rejoined us. Through a grimace, the officer said, "Brett Jones's parents called us earlier this morning to say their son went out to fish on their dock before dawn and disappeared." Well, he's let our son all over the place this week, Mom said. Could he have just biked off to another spot on the lake or something? The officer replied, He didn't say he was going anywhere else, but we're checking everywhere, ma'am. That's why we're looking through the caves. She appeared to choose her next words carefully. There's heightened concern for this child because he left all of his fishing gear on the dock with a line still in the water, and we... This time when she paused, she looked uncomfortably towards me and Claire. We found evidence that makes us think he might be in danger. Blood. Blood and fingernails. That was the evidence she referred to. I would later read in an article about Brett's disappearance that the responding officer found bloody fingernails embedded in the wood at the end of the Joneses' dock. They were buried in scratch marks, which indicated he had most likely been dragged into the water. During our silent drive, we passed parked police cars and saw search and rescue vessels out on the lake. Nearing town, Dad said, I know this is a small thing to worry about considering the circumstances, but we're running real low on bread and bottled water. With the storm rolling in, I just don't want to get stuck without supplies. No, that makes sense, Mom replied, somewhat absently. Dad asked, Want me to drop you and the kids off before I hit the store? Mom said, No, it's on the way. We parked at Harry's a couple of minutes later. Dad told us we could stay in the car, but Mom insisted we all stay together. Brett's disappearance rattled her more than I'd ever seen her rattled before. She looked dazed, like she had just seen someone get shot in the street. Me, I tried to hold out hope, but I also could not stop thinking about Nico Craw snatching my friend from his dock in the wee hours before sunrise. Had he snuck up on Brett the way Brett snuck up on me the day we met? Did he pull him into the water and drag him back to his house? And feed him to a vampire? My darkest mind added. I kept telling myself Brett could still be alive. They had not found his body. But my darkest mind whispered, the vampire has it. Mom and Dad shopped for the necessary items, and then some, while Claire and I lingered by the counter. Harry came out of the back office and stopped when he saw us. He offered a grim smile before sitting on his stool. I'm sorry, he said, scooting the stool up to the register. About Brett, I said, Yeah, we just found out he's missing. Our parents arrived, shoving their armloads of goods onto the counter. Dad said, Figured you'd be busier with the storm coming. It's the off-season, don't you know? Replied old Harry. Then, unable to refuse the gossip, Your kids and I were just chatting about that missing boy. Must be tough, since they all knew each other. Mom started to say, How did you know? But Harry waved her off. The lot of them came in together just yesterday, wasn't it? Well, maybe they'll find him safe, Dad suggested. Harry looked sorrowfully doubtful. He said, The police came in here. Gotta check everybody out, right? Asked me all sorts of questions, seeing how most folks in the area come through here at one time or another. Looking straight into my eyes then, he said, I told 'em who I suspect of any foul play that might have occurred, and where they might look for him. You know who did it? Mom asked. If it's been done, ma'am, but I best not go defaming anybody yet. Just keep your children close, will ya? That'll be 2639. As we rounded the bend toward our house, I saw a police car in Brett's driveway. As we passed by his house, a police officer came out the front door, followed by Brett's parents. His mother wiped tears from her eyes. I craned my neck to watch them as Dad turned onto our driveway. The officer led Mr. and Mrs. Jones to their truck and opened the door for Mrs. Jones. He pointed up the road and nodded a few times. They were talking. Then the hedges blocked my view. I didn't like the look I had seen on Mrs. Jones's face. It looked like all traces of hope had vanished. Making everything more depressing, the predicted storm began to roll in. Heavy clouds gathered like an invading army on the horizon. We could already hear the earliest booms from their artillery. The rain came at dinner time while Claire and I sat in mournful silence at the table. Neither of our hands left our laps as we stared at the food on our plates. Mom and Dad were still in the kitchen, arguing. At home, our real home, the kitchen was a separate room. They argued in there a lot. I don't think they had quite realized they were basically in the same room as Claire and I, thanks to the more open floor plan in the rental. We listened to them go back and forth about whether we should just pack up and leave that night. Mom fought desperately in favor of leaving right away, but during the course of their argument, the storm intensified significantly, and Mom conceded. They finally joined us at the table. "You're not eating?" Mom asked. "I'm just not very hungry," Claire said. "You either, Ty?" she asked me. "Not really," I said. "I just want to know what happened to Brett." Dad said, "You don't know, they might still find him alive." I noticed he didn't say safe as he and others had previously. The likelihood of Brett being safe shattered when the clouds burst open and violent waves started crashing over the bank. Claire went up to her room after dinner as usual, but I stayed with Mom and Dad in the den. I fired up the video game emulator, but couldn't decide what to play. It felt wrong to have fun. I'd have been out looking for Brett if my parents would have let me. I thought the storms had probably ended most of the search efforts early anyway. As I scrolled through the seemingly endless list of available games, I heard a phone ring. "That yours?" Dad asked Mom. She shook her head. Dad looked confused. He glanced toward the kitchen. "Does this place have a landline?" He followed the ring into the kitchen and noticed for the first time a small phone plugged into a dock by the toaster oven. He picked it up. "Hello?" I heard him say. Then, "Harry. Wait, from the grocery store? Hold on, I can't hear you. Just a sec. How do you set the volume on this thing? Okay, maybe this..." Why was Harry calling? I suddenly remembered another phone I'd seen in my parents' room. I ditched the emulator and ran upstairs. With landlines, you could pick up another phone to listen in. I'd seen this done in movies. You just had to be careful not to make any noise so nobody knew you were listening. I took the phone out of its station and brought it into my room. "How did you get this number?" I heard Dad ask. I carried the phone into my room and shut the door, then went to sit by my window. "I've got numbers for almost every house in the Shallows," Harry replied. "Anyway, I just had a cop in here. Bad news, I'm afraid. He says they found a body in the water. The boy, Brett, his parents just confirmed it was him." Dad said, "Oh no, I'm sorry to hear that. Is there anything we can..." "Hold on, there's more," Harry cut in. "I told that officer for the second time that they need to look at a man named Nico Craw. Your son is familiar with him." I instinctively looked out at Nico's house across the inlet. Rain cut across my view at a near horizontal angle. The trees behind our house were all bending dangerously, but our trees weren't what I noticed when I looked out that big window. I noticed another tree across the water, a tree that had been uprooted by the storm and fallen over on the back of the Craw house. It had smashed the rear deck before rolling down the bank and crushing the dock. The Craw house, which had already seemed to tilt backward, looked about to topple over. I heard Harry say, "They're already looking into Nico, apparently, but the storms put a pause on the investigation. They found the boy's body floating behind Nico's house, and I guess they don't think he drowned." I found it unfortunately easy to imagine Brett's cold corpse floating face down in the lake due to how he introduced himself to me. I recalled how he had floated up and bumped my toes momentarily convincing me a dead boy had surfaced at my feet. We'd shared more than one good laugh about that since, but now the joke made me sick, quite literally. Thinking about it truly made me feel I might vomit.
They've been looking for Nico all afternoon and can't find him. I'm calling to tell you to keep your doors locked and to watch out for him. Your son knows what he looks like. Just, please, lock your doors.
Sure thing, said Dad. I was listening to them, but my attention remained primarily on the Craw house. 2 of the 8 windows on the back wall had shattered, either from debris or being crushed by the weight of the falling house. And then, all at once, the back wall collapsed. The rest of the house seemed to close over it like a whale clamping its mouth shut. The sides twisted and collapsed with nothing to brace them against gravity. In seconds, all but a few sturdy pieces of frame remained standing. "His house just collapsed," I yelled into the phone.
Huh?
Asked Harry.
Ty?
Asked Dad.
Have you been listening this whole...
His words got cut off by a dull tone. I ran back to the master bedroom, hung up the phone, and picked it back up. I listened again, but the tone was all I heard. The storm knocked out the phone lines. Then the lights went out. When I entered the hallway, I heard Claire's scared voice behind me say, "Ty?" I turned around. Claire stood in the doorway of her room, eyes red and cheeks glossy with tears. Behind her, in the dark, stood a tall figure. He was dressed in black from the very top of his head to his feet. On his face, he wore large, darkly tinted goggles. The figure shoved my sister into the hallway and stepped out of her room. He held a knife to her back. In the hallway light, I saw he was wearing a black wetsuit, complete with a skin-tight hood. He looked like a giant, wingless bug. Keeping one hand on his knife, the man used the other to lift his goggles, revealing cold, blue eyes. He then peeled back the hood. Wadded up black hair fell around his fox-like face. The man, holding a knife to my sister, was Nico Craw. Chapter 5. Nico Craw, he waited, in the dark, to have his chance, to use our family to his end and stop his sister's plans. And to the caves he took me, to stop her evil curse. But I feared we would not all survive, her powers at their worst. Nico Craw must have snuck in while we were up at the caves or stocking up at Harry's for the storm. Being out of our daily habits, we frequently left the back door unlocked by accident during our stay in Lorna Shallows. Nico hid in Claire's room until she discovered him crouched way back in her closet. He held her hostage in her room until he heard me come out of mine. Then he instructed me to go downstairs and pushed Claire to follow me. She obeyed rather than get poked in the back with Nico's knife. "Ty, what's wrong?" Mom asked after one look at my face when I came down the stairs. Then she saw Claire, and the third person, dressed in a black wetsuit, with a knife to her daughter's back. She screamed to Dad, who came running. "Stay back," Nico commanded. He brandished the knife, then returned its point to Claire's spine. Dad ran back to the phone and dialed 911, but only got the dial tone again. Nico said, "We all need to come to an understanding, because I'm not going back out there. That storm could kill me, and the cops are still crawling all over looking for me. "Who are you?" Dad demanded. "My name is Nico Craw. I'm sure you've heard it by now. Listen, I did kill that boy, and I'm sorry about it." "What?" I snarled. I'd already assumed as much, but hearing him brazenly admit it infuriated me. "I said I'm sorry about it. I've killed lots of people." He looked at me and added, "Yes, including my own family. I know you must have heard what everyone says about me. I'm going to tell you all the full truth because I need your help. The police are looking for me, like I said. If they lock me up, everyone in Lorna Shallows will be in extreme danger. Trust me." No one moved or spoke. "Look," said Nico, "the only reason I'm holding this knife is to make sure nobody does anything stupid. I'm standing here admitting to murder in front of you so you know I'm not lying, okay? I really, really need you to trust me." Mom asked the simple question, "Why?" Nico said, "Do as I say, and I'll tell you." Not that we had much of a choice. He directed us all to the den where there were no windows. He told us to sit, but we all remained standing. Conceding this small victory to us, perhaps as a show of good faith, Nico began his story. Almost 11 years ago, when I was in college, I got a phone call that I needed to come here because my family was found dead. In case you haven't heard, my parents and sister were found hanging from the back deck of their house, which is my house now. All the blood had been siphoned from their bodies. Officially, my sister murdered my parents and hung herself. Then animals or insects or something sucked them all dry. Lazy work from the coroner, in my opinion. He didn't concern himself too much with what happened to my family after they were killed. He only seemed interested in what happened to them while they were still alive, and he didn't even get that part right. Because it was I who murdered them all, for the most part. The cops decided I wasn't here that night because my roommate on campus confirmed my alibi. What he didn't know was I filled up my car earlier that day, then I drove from campus to the Shallows and back without making any stops. Barely made it home with any gas left in the tank, but I pulled it off. Since I was only here for about 30 minutes in the middle of the night during off-season, nobody saw me, and when my roommate woke up the next morning, there I was in my bed, just as I had been when he went to sleep. In hindsight, my plan had holes all over it, like, what if my roommate had woken up? But it worked. "What made you do it?" Mom asked. Fear still painted the edges of her voice, but in the meat of her tone, I heard bold determination to keep Nico talking until something else happened. Since I'm being honest, greed, mostly. But also, my sister and I hated our parents. That made it easier. They tried so hard to isolate us, to keep us away from popular culture. They had such high and narrow standards for what it meant to be good. That's part of why we were always up here after everyone else left. It kept us separate. Anyway, college wasn't working out for me, and I just could not imagine a life spent sitting at a desk or in the endless pursuit of political accomplishment. Sort of as a joke, I suggested killing our parents to Nina. I was surprised by how seriously she took it. Before we knew what we were doing, we hatched a plot. We were going to frame it as a home invasion. Nina would say she managed to hide and witnessed the whole thing. She would say 2 men, neither of which looked like me, barged in and strung up our parents. The sleeping pills in their systems? Just a part of their nightly routine. Which is true, actually. We only gave them higher doses of medications they were already taking. Got any water?" Nico paused after this request, and Dad realized he was talking to him. Claire," Dad said. "Could you go grab him a cup of water?" "Nah-uh," Nico chided. "She stays with me. You," he pointed at me. "Get me some water." "Plastic cup," Dad whispered as I passed. Nico already had a knife, so I'm not sure what exactly he thought he was preventing. As I filled a plastic cup with water, the kitchen sink was in full view of the den, I listened to Nico continue his story. "Everything went perfectly. Mother and father passed out, and we dragged them to the deck, put the nooses around their necks, and let them fall. I had set up a third noose, which I told Nina was there in case one of the others failed. But later, I told Nina to look over the edge and make sure neither of our parents were touching the ground, and when she did, I slipped that third noose over her neck and pushed her before she could scream. But she caught a hold of the deck. I tried to pry her hands free, but she was strong. I'll admit, the only regret I've ever experienced about that night I experienced while fighting Nina. She fought so viciously and with such determination. Ending her life felt like such a waste. I tightened the noose so she couldn't yell. She could probably barely breathe, but she whispered to me just before she finally fell to her death. Ah, yes, thank you. I handed Nico his plastic cup filled with water. What did she say? I asked as he drank. When he reached the bottom of the cup and tipped it all the way back, I motioned for Claire to step forward away from the knife. She moved slightly towards me. It wasn't much, but I thought it might buy her a split second to escape when the moment arose. She said, Nico continued, "I'll kill you for this. If I have to come back and kill you from the grave, I'll kill you, Nico." And then she fell, and I heard her neck snap. It was so loud I thought the rail she was tied to cracked. She died within seconds, and I killed her for greed over what turned out to be a hollow estate. Most of my parents' wealth was burdened by debt which had to be settled before I saw a dime of their money. I got to keep the house and enough cash to get by for a few quiet years. I planned to hide out there and work out my next move after the spotlight on my family faded. He paused and let the hand holding the empty cup drop to his side. The cup slipped out of it and rolled across the floor. Nico held a distant look and acted as if he didn't notice he'd dropped the cup, his hand still curved in a C around its ghost. However, he continued, my sister made good on her promise. Part of it. She returned to me as she laughed at the situation I'd created for myself. Then she gave me a choice. She could do as she'd sworn to and kill me. She warned me what might lay in store on the other side for someone like me, someone so consumed by greed he could kill his entire family. Or she would let me live if I dedicated my life to her service. And if I did a good job, she told me she may consider viewing me as a brother again and lend me her powers in my ascent to whatever position I desired. All the power a man could dream of in exchange for being a slave. What did you have to do for her? Mom asked. Did? You mean what do I have to do for her? Nico said. Well, the type of spirit my sister returned as is something called a strigoi. It's sort of similar to a vampire, which I've heard some people speculate about living in my house. I've even been accused of being one myself. But a strigoi is different. It's the disembodied spirit of someone who died with an intense desire for vengeance. Strigoi can slaughter and spread diseases, They can make a person go insane. The only way to get rid of them is to destroy their original body, and the most thorough way to do that is to burn it. I'm sorry, Mom interjected, but I think you might be avoiding my question. All right, Nico replied. He straightened his posture and transferred the knife pointed at Claire's back to his other hand. I bring her sustenance. Strigoi must survive off the blood of human victims. Nina started with the blood of our parents. Then, desperate for more, she drained her own corpse. These days, I try to bring her someone who isn't contributing anything to society. Yet. Yes, oftentimes they are children. I find children easy to trick. I almost got you, he said, looking at me. Drunks are easy too, but Nina doesn't care for the taste of their blood. She prefers children, and I'm sworn to obey. If, that is, I want to reap her rewards. So you grabbed Brett off his dock? I accused. Then what? You couldn't have just carried him up to your house or someone would have seen you. No, Nico said, shaking his head. All Nina needs is blood. Sometimes I can bring a living victim into the house and let her see to the rest. Other times, when it's been too long since I lured anyone in, I have to get creative. When the bodies are small enough, such as in the case of your little friend, I have an old embalming pump that does the trick. I'll grab a kid, drown them, and swim them out to my boat to pump them. It's risky to drain a body out there on the water, so I always do it in the dark, usually at night. Catching your friend before sunrise almost got me caught. I saw lights coming on in his house while I was still draining his corpse. I didn't have time to move his body afterwards and still get home before anyone saw me. Stupid. I risked everything with him, but Nina was getting hungry and things didn't quite work out with you, Tyson. He was an easy target. You're sick, Dad said. Mom shot him a warning glance, but he ignored her. There's no vampire. You're just a maniac. What do you do with all that blood, huh? Where does it really go? Nico answered, Sir, it is very important that you believe me. Soon, you will be forced to. If I'm arrested, no one will be there to keep Nina at bay. She'll be unleashed on this little town, and when she feeds all she can here, she'll move on. I am the only one keeping everyone safe from her. I keep her trapped in my attic, and she only stays because I keep her satisfied. The cops will take me away as soon as they find me, and I have to make sure Nina's gone for good before that happens. I've accepted that she'll never give me what she promised. But Nico, I said, your house just collapsed. A tree fell on it, and I think the wind blew it down. Thunder shook the house as if the storm was screaming victory. Nico's face fell. Are you lying to me? Is this a trick? He asked. I said, No, I watched it happen from my window. The whole thing just caved in. The hand holding the knife to Claire's back dropped. Nico's posture fell. He shook his head, subtly at first, then violently. No, he said. He looked at me. You'd better not be lying. If what you're saying is true, then we need to go now. We have to destroy my sister's body before... Another sound came from outside. This one, in contrast with the roaring thunder, screeched high above the howling wind. It sounded like a mix of a cawing crow and a vengeful woman and came from the direction of the inlet. My parents and Claire all looked toward the windows, so I knew I hadn't invented the sound in my head. It was real, and Nico seemed immediately to recognize it. She's here, he said. Hide. Nico pushed Claire toward Mom, partly, I believe, as a display of goodwill. He wanted to show my parents that his fear over the thing we heard outside trumped any designs he had for us. We all ducked behind the nearest object in the dark den. For me, it was the video game emulator, which had blacked out when the power shut off. This allowed me an angled view through the living room of the front window, which looked out at the driveway and our poor car rocking in the wind. The front door stood a few feet away from the window. I couldn't tell whether it was locked in the dark. I watched the front window with one eye, keeping the rest of my body shielded behind the emulator. Everyone else, including Nico, found room behind the 2 long couches in front of the projector screen to hide. The rain fell in staggered splashes cut by heavy wind. It crashed against the front window, blurring my view, then running off and allowing me to see for a moment before the next wave. Between splashes, I thought I saw a person dressed like Nico in all black, standing next to our car. Rain crashed against the glass, obscuring my vision long enough for the figure to vanish. Lightning flashed, lighting up the yard. Broken branches lay everywhere. Fortunately, none blocked the car. Rain crashed again. The next burst of lightning flashed. In the decorative, frosted glass window on the front door, I saw the silhouette of a person's head. I saw their full shadow across the front window. "Somebody's at the front door," I whispered. Nico whispered back, "It's her. Shh." "Nico." A high voice crackled through the door. It sounded as harsh as the rain. It crackled again. "Nico, Craw," rising in pitch as it held the name out. Thunder growled above. "We should just give him to her," Dad suggested. Nico hushed him, but Dad continued, "No, really, if she wants him, why don't we just give him up?" "Dad, seriously, be quiet," I begged. A dark mass had begun to creep in front of the window in the most recent splash of rain. The water obscured the shape, but I thought I could make out a head and shoulders and long, spindly arms. "If you give me to her, she wins," Nico said, almost too quietly to hear. "She won't stop, and she already has her sights on your son." "What?" Mom exclaimed. The shape at the window rushed forward, placing bony white hands on the glass. Rainwater trickled around its fingers. I drew my head back behind the emulator before the water cleared. "She's right there," I said, almost gasping out the words. Everyone remained quiet. "Nico," came the high voice, reflecting off the window in wet echoes. "Nico, Craw." I held my breath, waiting for her to pass. I wondered again, was the door locked? Did it matter? I thought I remembered something about vampires needing an invitation to enter a home, but did that apply to... what had Nico called her? A strigoi? Lightning struck somewhere nearby. Maybe it hit the water, and sent a shockwave of thunder through the house. Then all went silent, but the beating rain and rumbling wind. I risked a tiny peek out from behind the emulator to see if Nina Krull was still staring through our window and instantly regretted it. Not only was she still there, she had pressed her pale, flat face against the glass between her rigid hands. Her skin, if you could call it that, was stretched thin around her eye sockets, nose, and mouth, giving her face the appearance of a naked skull. The whites around her blue irises, paler than Nico's, were riddled with black veins. Her long black hair clung to the window glass around her face. It spread out around her like the snakes on Medusa's wicked head. The tension of her skin drew her lips back in a shape like a smile, but without any joy. The only feeling the smile conveyed was hunger, probably due to her 2 long fangs protruding in place of her canines. I drew back the moment I saw her face, but it was burned into my mind forever. I could still feel her staring straight in my direction. The front doorknob began to turn. I only heard its tinny rattle for a second before a cracking burst of thunder. Nina struck the door with a hard thunk, and I breathed a sigh of relief. The door was locked. Leaving us with another piercing shriek, Nina fled the porch. "She'll be back," Nico said once he could comfortably assume she'd left. "So here's the plan." In urgent whispers, he outlined a plan in which we would all run outside and escape in our family car. Nico would lead us up to the Lorna Caverns and take us to where he had Nina's remains safely stashed. "Just take the damn car and go yourself. Get that thing away from us. The keys are on the kitchen counter," Dad said. "I can't leave you here for her," Nico said. "I'm not trying to be a hero. If she gets you all before I can destroy her remains, she could become more than strong enough to stop me. I'm the only one who knows how to find her remains, so if I die, it's doomsday for this whole town." At the end of the next burst of thunder, we all heard a thud on the roof. "Quiet," Nico needlessly commanded. We all listened intently. I believe Dad was considering Nico's plan, weighing it against everything the man had told us. "He's telling the truth, Dad," I whispered. Dad popped his head over the couch to look at me, though we could barely see one another in the dark. "How do you know?" he asked. How did I know? I guess it all just made sense to me. Maybe I still possessed just enough of my childish imagination to bridge the gaps between Nico's verifiable claims and the supernatural elements of his story. Plus, I had seen Nina. Whatever she had become could not be explained by reason. I needed something to help me understand her existence, and Nico's story was all I had. Before I could answer Dad aloud, an enormous crash sounded upstairs. I believed correctly. The sound was my big bedroom window shattering inward. "She's inside! Go!" Nico exclaimed, rising to his feet. He leapt over the couch and ran to the kitchen counter, where he quickly scooped up the car keys. Dad tried to beat him there, but realizing he was going to lose, he redirected himself to the front door. Mom, Claire, and I chased after him. The four of us opposed Nico at the front door, all standing in his way. "We don't have time to argue," Nico pled. "If you want this to end, you have to take me with you." "Or we could leave and let you deal with it," Claire said. Mom and Dad nodded in agreement. "If I fail, she'll come after you next. I've already told you that," said Nico. Upstairs, a few floorboards creaked. They did not croak individually as if under footsteps, but rather groaned together as if joined in supporting some great weight, like the springs of a trampoline all stretching together. The focal point of the groans moved across the floor, reverberating through the ceiling above us. Then it reached the stairs. "Fine," Dad conceded. "Let's just go." Nico pushed through us and unlocked the door. I watched Dad study his neck as if trying to decide how easily he could snap it. But I looked away as soon as the stairs behind us began to groan, sounding as if they might buckle. I looked up them, and there, standing at the very top, or hovering, rather, was Nina Krull, her body shrouded in robes of black shadows. Her black hair spilled over her face, veiling the expression of malice which crept through its thin strands. "Hurry!" I shouted. Claire and Mom saw her too. They both screamed, and Mom shoved Dad out the door after Nico. We all spilled into the storm. Nina screeched and flew down the stairs in pursuit. I, the last out the door, slammed it behind me. She thudded against it just as it closed. Terrified, and with nothing but the unlocked door between me and Nina, I tore past my family and reached the car only second to Nico. He unlocked it and jumped into the driver's seat. Claire tripped over a branch in the driveway and fell hard on her knee. She cried out, and Mom stopped to help her up. She hoisted Claire to her feet, but the knee which hit the ground buckled beneath her. Mom kept her upright, but had to help her limp to the car. Dad remained equidistant from me and them, torn between his son standing beside an admitted murderer and his wife and limping daughter. The front door whipped open. Nina Craw hovered in the doorway. In the dark, she looked merely like a floating head as she stared out at us with bulging eyes. Dad ran to help Mom as Nina floated out onto the porch. As lightning flashed, she raised her arms. Her fingers curled in excitement for fresh victims. "Get in." Nico got back out of the car and grabbed me. He shoved me in, over the driver's seat and into the front passenger's seat. He dove in behind me and slammed the door. "No, don't take me. I can't leave them," I shouted, but Nico ignored me. He started the car and slammed it into reverse. In the taillights, I watched Dad realize I had been snatched. I could not hear him over the rain, the wind, the rumble of the engine, but I saw his face contort in a defeated scream. He had his arms around Mom and Claire. Nina was closing in. Nico slammed the brakes and jammed the car into drive. He punched the gas and we lurched forward. I spun around in my seat to watch what would happen to my family. Dad let go of my mom and sister to pick up a long branch. He waved it at Nina, forcing her back. I saw Dad shout something to Mom as he fended off the assailing spirit. Mom half-carried Claire back toward the house, but Claire's knee already seemed to be getting better. Soon they were running. As soon as they reached the door, Dad threw his branch at Nina and ran to meet them there. As Nico and I turned off the driveway and sped through the storm, I saw my sister slam the front door shut. Then I lost sight of Nina in the dark. All I could do was hope my family could fend her off until Nico and I completed our mission. I prayed that Nico was telling the truth. Nico and I drove in silence. I needed to overcome my disbelief at the situation in which I found myself before I asked any of the questions barraging my mind. Just a couple of days ago, Nico was nothing but a shifty character I'd been warned to avoid, and now I was riding shotgun through a violent storm with him, driving up to the hills to destroy his sister's remains in order to kill her vampiric spirit. "We have to stop at my house first," Nico said, breaking the silence. I said, "Your house is gone, remember?" I realized Nico still had not seen the ruins of his home. He only had my word that it had been destroyed. Nico replied, "Hopefully we can still find what we need then." I waited a few seconds, then asked, "What do we need?" "Gas," said Nico. "Gas and something to light it with." "You're gonna burn her?" I asked. The muscles in Nico's throat tightened, and he said nothing. We rounded the last bend and arrived at the skeletal remnants of the Craw house. Nico mumbled a medley of curses as he pulled over in the street. There was too much debris for us to pull into his driveway. Nico surveyed his property, trying to decide whether it was worth our time to search the wreckage for his supplies. "I kept the gas in the boat under my tarp," he said, still staring out his window. "Did you see? Is the dock still there?" "No, the tree crushed it," I told him. I didn't even see his boat. I wondered if it had been impounded or drifted away in the storm even before the dock's destruction. "Okay, do we have a lighter?" he asked. I opened the center console and found 2 Bic lighters amongst the spare change and napkins. Nico said, "Great. We'll figure out the fuel on the way." Less than a minute later, I noticed a big light ahead, yellow and welcoming. "What's that?" I asked, wondering if it might be somewhere we could pick up gasoline. I wanted to hurry up and find some so we could complete our mission before my family's defenses gave out back at the house. "It's Harry's," Nico said. "He must be running a generator." Don't know why he's at the shop during this storm, though. Think he has gas? I asked. Nico said, he doesn't sell it there, but he must have some on hand to run those lights. I can't go in there, though. He'll never give me any. Can I trust you? I have to save my family, I answered. Nico nodded. Harry's parking lot was miraculously clear, so Nico drove me right up to the front door. I jumped out and ran inside.
Everything okay, son? Why'd your parents send you out in this?
Harry yelled from behind the counter. Thunder rumbled, buying me time to think of an answer. He started waddling over to me.
When the phones went out, I started worrying about you folks.
I struggled to come up with something to say. Harry, to me, seemed like someone who could recognize dishonesty by instinct. I knew I couldn't convince him with lies. We need gas, I said, then added, our power's out, so…
Well, I'm sorry, son. The only gasoline I have on hand is what I need for my own Jenny. Gotta keep the lights and heat on in case folks need somewhere to shelter, you know. If you're cold, you folks are welcome to stay here until it's safe.
No, we just need gas, but thank you. I didn't have an excuse. As expected, Harry immediately grew suspicious.
You do, huh?
Harry asked. He looked past me at the headlights outside.
Who brought you here, son?
My dad, I quickly lied. Oops.
Well, how about I go have a chat with him real quick?
Harry picked an umbrella from a rack and walked toward the door. I followed close behind him, violently shaking my head as a warning to Nico. Harry caught my reflection and spun around to face me. When his back was turned, Nico got out of the car and pushed through the door. He caught Harry by the collar and shoved him backward all the way to the counter. Give us gas, old man, Nico demanded. Nico, don't hurt him, I begged. Harry said,
It's all right, son. I'll take care of this. Tell you what, Mr. Craw, how about I give you some gas and you leave that little boy with me?
Can't, was all Nico replied. I begged, Please, Harry, we really need it. It is for my family, I swear.
You don't have to lie for him, son.
I'm not lying, please, we really need it. Not even that much, only a half pint or so, Nico said. Then, showing good faith, he let off of the old shopkeeper and took a step back. Harry looked from me to Nico, then back and swallowed.
I got 2 cans in the back there by the Jenny. One's full, the other's probably got a bit more than a pint left in it.
Nico motioned for me to retrieve the gas and told Harry, Good choice. I found the 2 gas cans and took the emptier one. I didn't understand how Nico thought we could burn a whole body with such a small amount of fuel, but I didn't want to take any more of Harry's precious supply either. We left Harry at the counter and returned to the car to drive through the blustering storm. Nico had to take the winding road through the West Hills slowly. Halfway up, I asked, Is that going to be enough gas? Nico looked down at the red gas can between my feet, then back at the blurry road. He said, There's not much left of her now. She was cremated with our parents before their funeral. But one thing I didn't mention earlier, before I left my family hanging there that night, I trimmed Nina's fingernails because they had wood shavings in them from when she grabbed the deck rail. I thought that might look suspicious, so I cut her nails and picked up every single trimming. Then I had to cut some of her hair because I noticed it caught in the rope in a way that didn't look like she could have done it herself. And I put the hair in my pocket with the fingernail clippings. I forgot about them until after I got back to my dorm. It would take a while to explain why I didn't just throw them away. There were lots of intricate reasons. But long story short, I still had them when she returned to me as what she is now. She explained to me that part of her must not have been destroyed, otherwise she would have ceased to exist after her cremation. I guess those trimmings are all she needs to stay connected to our world. I said, I thought you still had her whole body. Why'd you hide fingernails and hair all the way up here? She didn't like me having her final remains so close by, Nico admitted. It was a trust issue mostly, but also the house could accidentally burn down or, he scoffed, blow into the lake. We had to keep her remains safe, and I found a nice place up here in the caves. Oh, is there a flashlight in here? Yeah, I said, opening the glove box. Dad's big flashlight rolled out faithfully toward my hands. Good, Nico said. We'll need it. We finally arrived at the Lorna Caverns parking lot. Nico turned to me and snapped his fingers to make me look at him. He said, You need to stay close to me. Got it? Got it, I said. But I still don't know what you need me for. Nico kicked open his door just as thunder rolled above. Far off, a wailing screech carried over the boom. Nico looked at me and sneered. I might need bait. Suddenly, I remembered my mission partner was a psychopathic killer who murdered his family for money and had been feeding helpless victims to a vampire for his own personal gain for years. All of his talk back at the house about how he needed our help and the danger we would be in if we didn't aid him, some of it may have been true, but Nico was still only looking out for himself in the end. Still, when stuck between a psychopathic killer and a bloodthirsty, vampiric spirit, I chose the former. Better the enemy you know, as they say. I followed Nico through the rain, carrying the gas can and trying to keep the lighters dry. Nico took the flashlight. The rain soaked us by the time we entered the large mouth of Lorna Caverns. Inside, a curtain of rain separated us from the wind, but the air was freezing cold. I started to shiver immediately after I quit running. Yeah, it's cold, said Nico. How about we go start a fire? He showed me which tunnel to follow and led the way with Dad's flashlight. In a couple of places, I had a hard time negotiating Harry's red gas can through the narrow passages. I had to contort all sorts of ways, as did Nico, but the gas can could not flex and wiggle like we could. I thought I heard that screeching sound again, somewhere back the way we came from, and said, Hey, Nico. What? That screech we heard out there earlier, was that Nina? I think so. I struggled through a difficult section, then asked, Does that mean she left my family alone? Nico paused to look back at me as he said, It means she's probably coming after us. I noticed he did not answer my question, but how could he have known anyway? Thunk. The gas can caught between two parallel bulges in the walls. I pushed it up. I slid it down. It simply did not fit. Nico, the can's stuck, I said. Nico squeezed the flashlight back past his belly so he could shine it in my direction. Yeah, that's not getting through, he admitted. All right, leave it. We'll have to go get her remains and bring them back through here. Should I wait here? No, she'll be here soon. I want you to stay close to me, he said. I left the gas can there in the tunnel and hurried after him. We wormed so deep into the cave that I feared Dad's flashlight might not have enough battery to lead us back out. Fortunately, we reached a wider chamber shortly, and Nico said, This is it. He got down on his hands and knees and pointed the flashlight toward the wall. There were a few loose rocks covered in a fine layer of dirt at the end of the flashlight's beam, and Nico began to dig them up. Weren't you worried someone might find this? I asked. Who would be looking for one of these way down here? He asked in return. He held up a dirty rock, turned it over, and twisted the bottom. It was one of those hide-a-key rocks you can buy at a hardware store, only instead of a spare key, Nico's rock contained a plastic sandwich bag full of black hair and crescent fingernail clippings. He pocketed the bag and dropped the fake rock. Okay, let's go. I waited for him to return to the tunnel first, but he motioned for me to go ahead. I said, You have the flashlight, you go first. No, Nico replied. I said, Okay, then give me the flashlight. No, he repeated. Then he said, I can't have you blocking my way if she's hiding up there and we need to turn back. What am I supposed to do if she's up there? I asked. Nico replied, Follow me. Fast. Anxiously, I entered the tunnel. I moved quickly even though I couldn't see where I was going. Nico's flashlight behind me barely illuminated anything. We reached the gas can, and I started to squeeze through the narrow gap which had blocked it. But then, up ahead, I heard a whisper. Nico, Craw. I froze, turning my head only so I could whisper back to Nico, She's here, go back. Nico nodded and swapped the flashlight between his hands. As I shimmied out of the narrow spot, he had already started to disappear down the tunnel. Wait! I whisper-screamed into the darkness which filled in behind him. Nico. The crackling voice hissed. She was close, and what scared me is that she could have been inches away and I wouldn't know until she grabbed me. I finally freed myself and started running blindly, chasing the fading light ahead. Behind me, I heard the gas can rattle against the rocks. Nina was right on my tail. Nico's athleticism far outpaced my own 10-year-old abilities. He and his light were too far ahead for me to catch up, and I could hear the raspy whispers of Nina Craw rapidly approaching. Continuing forward as fast as I could was all I could do. Soon, too soon for me to be close to the chamber where Nico was hopefully preparing a defense against Nina, I felt her closing in. I hoped Nico had thought of a second way to destroy her remains because we would not have any fuel for the fire. Maybe, I thought, we could break open one of the lighters, but none of that would matter to me if she caught me now. The lighters. I wondered if I had a small defense on hand after all. I reached into my pocket and pulled out one of the Bics, held my free hand in front of it, and pressed it. A tiny flame jumped up toward my hand. I held down the button and pointed the flame back at where I heard Nina's rattling and rasping coming from. I caught her reaching down at me from above. She was floating near the ceiling, staring down at me with that malicious smile, baring her sharp teeth. But at the sight of my tiny flame, she recoiled. She quickly realized the puny fire was no threat and moved forward again, but her hesitation bought me a second to squeeze through the next narrow passage. I emerged in the big chamber, with Nina reaching out for me again. When I jumped away, Nico stepped forward, holding the sandwich bag of remains out and pointing the flashlight at it. Hey, he yelled at Nina. She stopped, hovering in the center of the chamber, and turned her attention to him. Nico. See what I have? Nico asked. This is all that's left of your body. This is it, sis. So I'm thinking, Ty, throw me a lighter. I threw it to him. So I'm thinking, he continued, I can either set this bag on fire right now, the plastic might burn enough to destroy you, or I can leave it here where it's been safe for 11 years and you can let us go. And I mean go. I want out, Nina. I'm done. I want you to set me free. Nico, she rattled. No, Nina, I'm serious. Nothing you promised me has come true, and now my house is gone, my dock, my crappy boat. Nina twisted and lunged at Nico. He dropped the sandwich bag in order to put both hands on the flashlight and raise it up like a club, but before he had a chance to swing, Nina latched onto his throat. His final words were lost in a horrible scream. Nina slammed him against the wall once, twice, 3 times, until blood trickled down his face. Slowly savoring every drop, she licked the blood running from his face before latching onto his throat once more. I watched in the edge of the flashlight's fallen halo as Nico's left hand shriveled a little, then a little more. She was clearly taking more than blood out of him. Her remains were lying undefended in the middle of the floor. They were my only hope. While Nina was occupied, I snuck the sandwich bag away and slipped back into the tunnel once more. I still had one lighter that I hoped worked, and I would pick up the gas on the way. If I hurried, somehow beat Nina out of the cave by minutes, I could set the remains on fire before she emerged again. If I was not fast enough, though. Nina screeched just as I reached the gas can. Her echo resonated at an awful frequency in the tunnel, almost disorienting in its intensity. I assumed her cry meant she finished consuming her brother. She sounded energized. I was already moving as fast as I could, so I could only hope it was fast enough. When I started hearing rain, I knew I must be close to the cavern. Where the tunnel grew wide, though, I unscrewed the gas can's lid, and at my next opportunity, I unzipped the sandwich bag. Nina screeched again, as if sensing her sudden vulnerability. She sounded imminently close, but so did the cavern ahead. I could not see and did not trust my hearing amongst the echoing rocks. Sound did not behave normally down there. I couldn't wait. I wrapped the mouth of the plastic bag around the gas can's nozzle and poured a small amount of gasoline into it. As I moved through the next skinny passage, I shook the baggie, soaking its contents in fuel. The sweet odor burned my nose and lungs. The next time the passage widened, I reached into my pocket and took out the lighter, flicked it, and the flame sparked to life. It revealed the face of Nina Craw emerging from the passage behind me. Her hair fell over her eyes as she pulled herself through, failing to mask her dripping mouth. As her shadowy body coalesced behind her, I wasted no time. Dropping the gas can, I held the lighter under the bag of hair and nails, and it instantly caught fire. Nina screeched, this time in desperate agony, surrounding me with visceral echoes. Shadows spilled out of her open mouth as her body started floating apart. I almost forgot to let go of the burning bag. It fell to the ground in a splattered web of melting plastic and hair. The bag landed close to where the gas can had fallen on its side, and a small puddle of gasoline had spilled out of it. The trailing flame of one of the hairs brushed against this puddle, and Nina's remains vanished in a renewed blaze. Her scream grew hollow as the last of her earthly body became a cloud of smoke, which blackened the stone above her. Her eyes dissolved into this cloud, and more of her dark essence poured from their empty sockets. Nina's voice faded, morphing into someone else's. Someone small. Someone I recognized. The voice screaming within the black cloud belonged to Brett Jones. His scream faded, then became another, then another. The cries of each victim Nina Craw had claimed over 11 years poured out of her gaping mouth as she perished. And as the last of the gasoline burned, Nina's ghostly skull of a face finally vanished. I hurried toward the cave mouth while a small amount of flame still lit the way. When I reached the cavern, I let myself collapse on the floor. I was so cold and soaking wet, but ever so grateful to be alive. The question of my family's safety finally lifted me off the floor. I walked to the cave's mouth where the curtain of rain still hid me from the storm, but it had grown thinner. The storm had begun to dissipate while I'd been underground, which was good because I had a long, dark, wet, and cold walk ahead to get back into town. I wished I had one of Brett's bikes to ride back on. More than that, I wished I had Brett. I thought of the scream I'd heard, the one that sounded like him. It made me so angry now, how his life had been stolen to empower Nina, and now she was just gone. All those lives lost, least of all Nico's, in service of something that had vanished from reality, hopefully, forever. If such a thing as a soul exists, I hope I freed Brett's that night. I hope he's now at peace. With tears in my eyes, I jumped through the curtain. The rain now fell in straight lines. Wind still occasionally swept over the hills, but nothing like the violent gale from earlier. I slipped over wet rocks twice, first hitting my knee, then my elbow. I cried out in anger, pain, and sorrow. I didn't even know what I was walking towards. What would I find back at the house? The shriveled husks of my family? Nina came after Nico and I so quickly. Maybe she didn't spend any time draining my family and just left them there, slaughtered. Or maybe they're all okay, I thought. But I depressed this hope because it would hurt too much to have it ripped away. For now, I needed to worry about the trek back to town. I noticed 2 vehicles below, driving up into the hills. The first was a police car with a cracked windshield. The second was a battered maroon pickup truck that I recognized from somewhere I couldn't put my pruny, stiff finger on. I scrambled down to the Lorna Caverns parking lot, hoping to stand at the entrance and flag down the cop. Relief, knowing I might not have to walk all the way back down the hill, warmed me from inside. The cop saw me and momentarily flashed his lights in acknowledgement. He pulled to the side of the road and stopped. His passenger door swung open. Then a poncho-wearing figure rushed toward me. I waited stupidly, confused, until the figure, slowly becoming a woman, came within a few feet of me. She tossed her plastic hood back, and I saw the puffy, tearful face of my mother. Dad and Claire were riding in the pickup truck driven by none other than Harry. I later learned he locked up his shop right after watching Nico drive me up into the hills. He guessed where we were going. In an act of selfless bravery, he drove straight to my family's rental house to check on everyone there. On the way, he managed to flag down the police officer who had pulled over to wait out the worst of the weather. They found my family safe, locked inside the house. According to Dad, they locked the doors and blocked the door to my room shut so Nina could get no further inside, even when she flew back in through my bedroom window. She tried to break through, but they held her back with the blockade. She gave up after a while and left to pursue me and Nico. I told Dad their blockade had probably bought Nico and I the time we needed at Harry's to get the gas. I couldn't believe all of the little pieces that had fallen perfectly in place for us to be together again, alive, standing in the rain, laughing, hugging, and crying. Harry watched our reunion, stoic and satisfied. Oh, about Harry. I remain grateful to him to this day, even though he's been dead 6 years. I looked him up after I started writing this story. It hurts to know he's gone, but I'm sure he's in a better place. A guy like that's gotta be. After he died, somebody bought Harry's convenience store and changed the name to the ultra-boring Lorna Shallows Food and Supply. I've been feeling a bit aimless in life since I finished school, never really fitting into any particular career path. I've been thinking about buying that little shop by the marina, and I think I just might do it. I would change the name back to Harry's, of course, even though it's not his shop anymore. Because, truth is, if I do buy it, I'll only be able to because of all the times that good man saved my life during that week in Lorna Shallows. We left that dark place early on the morn of the 5th day. We packed our things in silence, with nothing more to say. A week of fear and pain and loss, a storm from up above, only brought our family closer and bound us tight in love. You made it out. Congratulations. If you enjoyed the story, please rate, like, review, or subscribe. For ad-free episodes and bonus Into the Woods episodes, become a patron with the link in the description. You can also support the show by buying merch. That link is also in the description below. To stay up to date, follow me on Instagram at The Warning Woods. If you feel ready, meet me here next week for another journey into the Warning Woods. Thank you for listening.